Hello, this is the continuation of the Staffs University Christmas lectures. This is our final lecture for today, and we have Dr. David Murphy with us today to talk about the preservation of video games. And I grew up a lot with playing games on like Miniclip or onemoreLevel.com before school. So I'm very interested to see what is being done to preserve those thousands of games that are going to be lost into the ether. So I'll bring David up. We'll have a bit of a chat, and then I'll pass over to him. So, hi, David.
Hello, Ben. How are you? And Merry Christmas to everyone who's joining us.
Thank you. Merry Christmas. Yeah,
Or
I didn't.
Happy Holidays. Or
No,
Happy Holidays. You know what I mean?
I haven't actually said that once this whole week. I am a terrible person. What was your favorite game that has been preserved?
Probably Maniac Mansion, the first one by the LucasArts game. Traditionally done in the Scum engine, released, I believe, for the Commodore 64, but it showed up on various microcomputers. But I'm a millennial weirdo, so my favorite version is actually the NES version, even though it's considered to be an inferior port, because that is the one that I encountered first and that I have nostalgia for.
Yeah, I find nostalgia can drive bias, which is really cool. Well, it can be cool anyway. So without further ado, I'll let you take over and talk about preserving video game history and culture. And I'm really excited. So please, David, do take us away.
Great. So I want to say thank you all for coming. And so the title for this talk is Before It's Too Late, Preserving Video Game History and Culture. I want to give a shout out to Henry Lowood, curator at Stanford Library. This talk is a riff on a title, Before It's Too Late. It was one of the first white papers that he ever actually wrote. About video game preservation. And if anyone is not familiar with Henry Lowood's work, he just published a recent book on all of his writing on video game preservation. So please check out Henry's stuff. He's probably one of the biggest, most well-known names in the field. Huge fan of him, and he continues to be an inspiration. Also, shout out to Chris Kohler. Obviously, if you notice the image that I'm showing you here, it's from a famous Wired article in which Chris Kohler, a video game critic who's been also talking about game preservation for a long time, writings for Wired and whatnot, who actually organized the excavation of the Atari ET site, famous landfill site, and that's an image from one of his articles there. Okay, so I should probably start off by saying a little bit about me. So my name is Dr. David Murphy. I have a PhD in communication and culture from Toronto Metropolitan University. I have a lot of research interests. I'm interested in game studies, platform studies. I teach narrative design. I'm interested in community management, and I also do research on digital heritage. So one area of my research that I've published on and continue to publish on is video game history, excuse me, and different approaches to preserving games. And I'll be talking a little bit about the field with all of you today. Traditionally speaking, a lot of the narratives that people would have developed surrounding preserving video games are often portrayed as being kind of negative. This idea like we have to preserve more stuff before stuff gets lost. What I wanted to do with this talk is to be a bit more celebratory and to give shout outs to the freaking amazing people who've been doing this work for like 20 years, who are all super awesome. So I want to provide you with an introduction to why game preservation is important, different approaches to game preservation that exist, gaps in current approaches to preservation, and also how you can get involved, whether you're a fan, whether you're a developer, whether you're an educator, and really trying to paint video game preservation as something that is important and that we know that we need to be doing more of, but also something that people have been doing for quite a long time that you can get involved with if it's something that is near and dear to your heart. Okay, so why is video game preservation important, right? Why do we need to ensure that games are preserved long term? Well, to begin, and this is not throwing any shade at industry, but those of us who've been studying this for a long time is aware that the industry actually does a poor job of preserving games for a variety of reasons, which include, but are not limited to, a concept that is referred to as manufactured obsolescence. Shout out to James Newman, British game critic, who's also the founder of the National, or one of the founding members of the National Games Museum here in the UK. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to talk about costs and turnover. A lot of studios don't always have the resources that they would like in order to create internal archives to preserve games. A major problem is also caused by turnover of staff. Um, Other major problem, many cases about this, studio buyouts and closures, right? If a studio gets bought out, ensuring that things are preserved in archive becomes a problem. Biggest problem, closures. When a studio gets closed, lots of stuff gets lost and it can be difficult in order to trace. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about industrial narratives of linear progress, which is the type of histories that people do in the game industry, and how the way in which the game industry, and in some cases game critics, describe the history of the industry doesn't really help us with respect to preservation projects, right? Um, so I'll start off with this idea of manufactured obsolescence, right? Now, this idea of manufactured obsolescence is based off of how the game industry used to run. Now, it's not really running this way anymore. There's been lots of changes, but it was definitely how the game industry used to run. Um, and it's basically this idea that the game industry used to strategically reduce access to older games in order to encourage players to pay full price for new hardware and software. So they wouldn't really offer a lot of commercial support for classic titles. And classic consoles, because when the game industry was very much tied to a traditional retail environment in which games had to be purchased from stores on store shelves, there was so much limited shelf space that they wanted to ensure that all the games and all the consoles that were taking up the shelf space were new and at higher price points. So people who went to the stores in order to buy new games would be more likely in order to pay full price for new games, right? Um, we still see this pattern kind of playing out within the industry to this day. Those of you who've probably heard about the recent news about Grand Theft Auto 6, right? You're going to have to invest in a new console to play GTA 6, for example, when it comes out. So if you haven't upgraded your console, that's something that you're going to have to do. So it's very much related to this concept, and it's something that James Newman actually goes into in depth into his book, Best Before. So highly recommended if you want to read that book and get James's take on the topic, right? So that's the first reason why the industry doesn't do a good job of preserving games. That there's literally business models that aren't that are based off of limiting access to older games, right? But as I said before, this is changing, and we can definitely talk more about that. I'm more happy. I'm also happy to answer questions about that, right? So the second reason why the industry doesn't do a great job of preserving games is cost and turnover. A lot of studios would like to do this. If you meet a lot of developers, or if you talk to developers about game history and game preservation, one of the first things that you'll learn is you'd be hard pressed to find any developer who thinks this isn't important. But unfortunately, a lot of them just don't have the time. They often don't have the space. And a lot of studios also don't have the staffing that's needed to develop and maintain internal archives, right? And this is even cases with studios that have been around for decades. They can have difficulty locating important artifacts like source code, for example. And that often has to do with turnover among staff, right? And those of us who are familiar with the game development pipeline and the game development process, right? The idea of having backups is integral to production. You need to have backed up source code, you need to have backed up files. But once a game shifts, there's often not centralization of these backups. So people often kind of forget where the backups are. They can be on old machines. They can even in some cases be on computers with the move to remote working. That could be on, an employee's hard drive somewhere else, or this has happened historically. So when someone leaves the company and goes to another company, they may even have backups in their possession that they don't turn over and put into an internal archive. So important documents, important aspects of games can be lost that way, right? Studio buyouts and closures. This is the classic example of how a lot of source code gets lost, how a lot of art gets lost, a lot of important design documents get lost, right? Even in cases where studios have maintained internal archives can be lost when studios are bought or closed. Departing staff can also play an active part in this process. And in some cases, there's even cases where departing staff have taken items that could be archived and even actually actively destroyed things because they may be upset over a studio being bought. They may be upset over a studio being closed. They may have been upset over the working conditions that they were put under when they were made this game. And then the studio gets bought. And so then they, run off with the source code and don't give it back. And that becomes lost. And then finally, one of the reasons why the industry doesn't necessarily do a good job of preserving games is, traditionally speaking, the industry has also been always been kind of associated with new technologies, right? An obsession with what's new. And the way in which the industry often kind of does its own history, and historians often refer to this as industrial histories, is that they often paint the industry as going through kind of a steady, uh, or they often narrativize the industry as something that has a narrative of steady linear progress through a timeline, right? So industries tend to struggle to preserve and represent their pasts in general, because there's a kind of tendency when industries do histories to emphasize commercial successes and downplay failures. So we often forget games that might have been important technically, that might have been important inspirationally, but actually didn't succeed in the marketplace. With an emphasis on games that actually sell well, being something that industries and industrial histories often focus on. And part of the reason that this happens is because um, most industrial histories are actually constructed by companies, and they're often designed to promote the company to things like outside investors and things of that, for example. So they're not really designed for the purposes. When companies tell their own histories, they're often trying to promote their successes, mitigate their failures, because they want, in some cases, if the company's publicly traded, investors to purchase stock in the company. So keep that in mind. Industries don't always have, I should say, industrial narratives are important. Industrial histories are important. You can learn a lot from them, but they're always somewhat limited, because even people who interview people from industry, when they're giving oral histories of the past, that things like developers who've retired and stuff, they tend to emphasize their successes, and they tend to not want to talk about failures. So you only get part of the story of what the industry was like at a particular point in time, right? Which means that, games that might have been important, games that might not even been released, don't always get preserved, and those are games that can be very important for those of us interested in game history, and will certainly important for future historians who want to know what it was like to make games. What were the difficulties associated with making games at different points in time? Okay. So in other words, while industrial preservation is still really important, different approaches to preservation are needed, right? We can't just rely on the industry to provide adequate resources for future educators, future developers, and historians interested in the remembering of national, regional, and transnational gaming cultures. Um, Another difficulty that we deal with when we're trying to preserve game history is that we often lack the strong national narratives that other areas of heritage and history have, right? So this idea of British gaming history, for example, can be complicated by the fact that a lot of people who grew up in the UK were playing games from Japan, for example. So we don't always have those kind of clean national narratives as well, because we're not really necessarily remembering national cultures, right? We're remembering national, regional, and transnational cultures. And there isn't a lot of precedent within digital heritage for preserving transnational culture yet. So that's also why the area of game history and game preservation is really exciting, right? Because we're really looking to try to preserve cultures that persist beyond our national imaginaries, cultures that have more inclusion and broader communities that have ever actually been preserved before from a heritage perspective. Right. So this gets me to what approaches to preservation currently exist, right? There's actually been people who've been tackling this problem for quite some time, 20 years in some cases. So the way that I actually kind of break this down is to talk about how there's basically kind of three different categories of preservation. I should say I am actually not seeing the comments at this moment, in case there's any comments in the chat. So I'll try and get to those afterwards, in case anyone put any kind of comments or questions already. So the three different approaches to preservation that currently exist, I would define them as industrial preservation, which I talked about a little bit more. Even though I gave you that whole list about why the industry doesn't necessarily do a good job of preserving game history, there's still a lot of work that the industry does that's actually good and important, and the industry is actually improving at this. So I'll talk a little bit about that. The second is institutional preservation, which is basically like our classic approaches to heritage. That's libraries, that's museums, that's archives. And then the third is vernacular presentation, which is basically like preservation that everyday people do, right? That can be private collections, work that collectors do, but that can also be what we might refer to as pirate archives or different online archiving initiatives that are not necessarily institutional. They're very much fan driven. And believe me, fans have done an amazing amount of preservation work already, and they deserve much credit for doing a lot of legwork that a lot of industry and institutions even benefit from to this day. So I'll start off with industrial preservation. So we can think about industrial preservation as when the industry basically preserves games and re-releases them, right? So that's ports, that's remakes, that's re-releases, which are becoming increasingly popular right now. That's also internal archiving processes that like publishers and studios do, and they keep some internal archives. And this is also experiencing growth due to the shift towards platform subscription services and digital storefronts, right? So, and particularly emulation, and and there's plenty of work that's being done in this area. The industry used to view emulation as competition. They often used to argue that emulation was bad because it violated copyright, but people are definitely changing. And that's very much directly related to the question that was just asked, which I'm going to bring up because it's a wicked question. So it's basically, would you say public interest in emulation and basically non-enforceable piracy, as it's an IP violation of a defunctioned product, had an impact on swaying corporate opinion in all games? Absolutely. And I've actually written about this. I'm actually the guy who kind of wrote about this. So thank you so much for asking that question. But basically, initially, when you're thinking also about the industry in terms of the embrace in emulation, it's important to point out that initially opposition to emulation was actually publishers. It wasn't necessarily developers. If you want to go back in terms of game history, some of the very first video games when they were created were actually emulated because they had to be emulated to be put on different mainframes computers, right? So developers have been emulating games in order to distribute them from the very, very beginning. Pong was emulated. If you want to look at the history of Space War, how it comes out of MIT, that was emulated in order to run on different mainframes. So emulation has a long, long history of being used. It was there right from the start. And exactly, part of the reason why there's a lot of negative attitudes towards emulation from the industry is a lot of it was coming from publishers. Nintendo's a particularly notorious company that's been anti-emulation, who saw it as competition with markets for old games, right? But the reality of the situation is what's happened is a lot of emulation projects were actually used and are increasingly now used by industry. And so you could look at something like the Nintendo Mini, which uses emulators that were actually fan created, that at one point in time Nintendo might have argued were a violation of their copyright, which are now being included in their commercial projects. So a lot of it had to do, in my opinion, with people who were experienced with emulation and have used emulation, then moving into industry and understanding just how useful it is, right? And now I'm sure you're more than aware that emulation is actually a part of publisher strategy and developer strategy now. With if you're buying games on the Xbox marketplace, if you're buying games on the PlayStation marketplace, you're actually being sold emulated games. So it's very much part of what we might refer to as the game service model now, when it wasn't before. But I would definitely say, like, yeah, a corporate opinion basically was, I wouldn't necessarily influenced by piracy, but in some cases it was. It's not. It's a fascinating question. I'll return to that in the end. Okay, cool. So so what are some advantages of industrial preservation, right? It's important to point out that there's certain things that the industry can do to preserve games that have advantages in compared to what archives and libraries can do and what kind of day-to-day everyday collectors can, right? So an industrial preservation advantage is, number one, developers can take advantage of new hardware developments to improve accessibility. A lot of old games aren't very accessible, particularly if you want to play them on original hardware. The hardware can be difficult to get up and running. Hardware like, consoles, right, isn't that hard in some cases to still access. In the future, it'll be increasingly hard. But if you want to think about like something like a mainframe computer, no one's putting together a mainframe computer in order to run something like Space War, right? So that's not happening, right? Yeah, can't play Fallout Tactics on Windows 10. I'll talk about this, how the problem's actually getting worse with recent games that have been related, right? Lots of games that were created for different platforms. Things like Flash is another major case. I'll talk about that a little bit more going forward. But there's all kinds of cases in which games that were even in some cases made relatively recently cannot be played on modern hardware. You might have to go and build a Windows 10 PC or something like that. And while you still want to be able to do that, today, 20 years from now, you may not, right? So the situation is definitely getting tricky, right? So the industry is good at taking advantage of new hardware developments to improve accessibility. You know what I mean? Like, so you don't have to build a PC with Windows 10 in order to play something like, Fallout Tactics, right? Which is difficult. People still do it, but it's difficult. The industry is good at having reissues that provide alternative revenue streams that also kind of allow studios to diversify their portfolios, in some cases avoid crunch, right? We have some studios that we've worked with, right, who do these types of things. Where instead of just having the studio being focused on the next release in order to keep the lights on, developing a catalog of IP that can be relied on can be a very, very useful strategy as well in order to keep studios and publishers afloat. And then finally, the industrial preservation advantages is this idea that if a game's been released commercially, it can be accessed legally for research and teaching purposes. Whereas if you're relying on emulation or you're relying on we might have referred to as pirated archives for teaching and research, and we know our students do it. There's historians that do it, right? Because they have to. That you're limited in terms of how you can showcase the information from those games due to issues that involve copyright, right? You might not be able to show images from the games in a book, for example, things of that type of nature. So that if the industry has re-released something, that it's easier to access it legally because you paid for it, right? And if you're asking for permission too, people are more likely to respond. That's another major issue, right? Disadvantage of industrial preservation, though, it's scale and scope, right? So this is from, some of you may be familiar with this, but it's from Phil Salvador's recent survey of video game reissue market in the United States. And this was done by the Video Game History Foundation and Software Preservation Network. It was brand new, released 2023. Only 13% of games released in the United States before 2010 are actually commercially available for contemporary platforms. PlayStation 2 games, if there's any PlayStation 2 fans, actually only have a 12% commercial reissue rate at the point in time. So if you want to buy a PS2 game and play it on a contemporary console, only 12% of that library is currently available to be purchased legally to run on a contemporary platform. American silent films actually have a higher commercial reissue rate at 14%, right? And yeah, exactly, Stardust. A remake of a game like The Last of Us is definitely an example of industrial preservation, right? A library or archive can't make a game 60 FPS, for example, or they can't yet, right? So that's definitely an advantage that the industry has when they release stuff. The issue is scale and scope, right? They're only really releasing major hits. If you actually look at what's being re-released in comparison to the catalogs, we're seeing like a 12% rate, which is very, very low for games that are currently being supported and re-released prior to 2010. So this links me to institutional preservation, right? Which is our kind of classic modern approach to heritage. So that's libraries, right? Love libraries, that's archives, and that's museums, right? This includes, but it's not limited to, permanent collections. So there's different libraries that have permanent collections of games, even if you think that they don't. There's actually some pretty awesome ones out there. Special exhibitions. So different museums will do special exhibitions of games. MoMA's done this. Major art museums have done this. Archives, right? Certain museums will have archives of games, university libraries too in some cases. The Strong Museum of Play in New York has an archive that researchers can go to with some interesting materials collected. And it can also include things like databases as well. So what are some notable university library collections? Stanford University Library has a great collection. So if anyone's sitting out there going, hey, what are the libraries out there who actually have good game collections? That's Henry Lowood is in charge of that. Stanford has a pretty amazing collection that's specifically related to a Sierra. So if anyone's interested in games that were created by Sierra, Stanford has lots of material associated with that very particular studio, who has a place in at least my heart, because I love adventure games, right? Another notable library collection, if anyone's interested in Japan, Japanese games, the Ritz, hopefully I pronounced this correctly, but it's the Ritsumeikan Center for Game Studies in Kyoto, Japan, has a library as well. And there's actually been some awesome movement in terms of universities in Japan starting to create archives and collections of Japanese games. If there's any fans of Japanese games and Japanese game history, that's awesome. Shout out to the University of Toronto, which has the Sid Bolton collection. Sid Bolton was actually a well-known collector from Canada, but he used to publish all kinds of articles. He used to publish things in Edge magazine. If anyone's have read Retro Games or anything like that, Sid Bolton was a frequent contributor. He had a private collection that, unfortunately, RIP, Sid recently passed away. And the collection was probably worth millions of dollars, but Sid actually donated it to the University of Toronto, and it's now probably the most extensive game library collection in Canada. Also, shout out to the University of Michigan, which has the Computer and Video Game Archive, another pretty well built up library collection that can be useful, right? Some notable museums, archives, and databases. As I said before, the Strong National Museum of Play in Rochester, New York. They have a pretty impressive archive. And an awesome museum to check out. Obviously, the National Video Game Museum, Sheffield, England. Those of you may have been there, those of you may have not. We've actually had a student trip that went there a little while ago. There's the Computer Spiel Museum in Berlin, Germany. This is an image of the Computer Spiels Museum right there. It's known for quite a good collection. There's the Finnish Museum of Games, Tampere, Finland. It has a good collection. There's the Australian Centre for the Moving Image in Melbourne, Australia. I have some good friends who have been associated with that collection, who've now gone into doing game studies and game history. And there's also the Nexon Computer Museum in Jeju City, South Korea. That's another museum that's in South Korea if you're interested in the history of games as well. So these are some of the more kind of well-known dedicated museums. If you're a game nerd interested in game history and you're looking to travel and visit game museums, these are on my bucket list. I want to visit them all at some point in time, because I think game museums rock. Okay, so what are institutional preservation advantages, right? What do libraries and museums have? Well, generally speaking, they're a little bit more accessible in some cases, if you can go there, I should say, than industrial preservation, right? You don't necessarily have to purchase the games, right? They'll often provide you access to games for historic research purposes for free if they have the rights to do it. They're often seen as definitely more stable, but that's not necessarily the case, unfortunately, due to some museums and some archivals struggling to maintain funding. But traditionally speaking, they're thought of as being more stable. Museums are generally very, very good at knowledge sharing, so they often promote their collections and they promote game history to the broader public. So even to people who might not identify as fans of games or gamers, right, by doing things like open days in which they bring the broader community in. So they're really good at knowledge sharing and promotion to the broader public. And when I say also knowledge sharing as well, museums often, the great thing about museums is that they often network with each other. They'll share resources, they'll share best practices, and they'll even share items in some cases for exhibitions. So there's lots of institutional preservation advantages. Unfortunately, we don't have as many institutions dedicated to game preservation as we should, right? Disadvantages. They can be a little bit biased, national and regional. So a lot of museums will kind of just focus on games that come from that particular region. And it's interesting, actually, in some cases, if you go to different game museums and see how they set up their collections and what they deem to be important. Competition. This is one of the biggest issues that museums face with private collectors. So if you follow game history closely, when games are found, let's say rare games that maybe haven't been released for like the NES gets found, museums often can't compete with private collectors for purchasing acquisitions. So there's a lot of stuff in private collections that would be amazing if they were in a museum, so anyone could access them, right? But most people who work at museums will talk about this. They'll say they basically rely on donations from private collectors. That if there's a sought after game, that's just kind of come to light. Someone found it. It's most often a private collector buying it, and not all private collectors will, let's say, dump ROMs and share the information about those games, right? And then finally, also cost and space. So a lot of game museums and a lot of game libraries and a lot of game archives are actually not as permanent as people would think. Libraries might start a game collection, but they may have difficulty maintaining it. They may have the staff needed to maintain it. People might know about it and they might not use it, and they might stop the game collection, right? Different museums that people have tried to open and keep open, in some cases, they have to move and switch locations in order to remain viable. So even the institutions that are seeking to preserve games, they can have difficulty getting funding and things of that nature, and they can run into issues with cost and space, right? Hardware is expensive, right? In order to keep, in order to maintain, and it actually takes up a lot of space, right? So that's a classic problem that museums have. They only have so much floor space, right? If a museum wants to like keep arcade games and preserve them with the original hardware, right, you need a lot of space to keep arcade games. You need to maintain them, and you need a lot of floor space. So cost and space are always an issue that museums have, right? So this brings me to vernacular preservation, which is what someone has asked about the role of kind of like piracy and this idea of pirated archives, right? So when I think about vernacular preservation, and it is true that there is a lot of people who do vernacular preservation projects that violate copyright. So when we're thinking about vernacular preservation, we're thinking about private collectors, right? We're thinking about fan emulation projects, things like the Multiple Arcade Machine Emulator, which is probably one of the most extensive fan-driven emulation preservation projects to this date. We're also thinking about what some people might refer to as pirated archives, right? So those are basically, it's linked to fan emulation projects, is people who basically will emulate games, dump emulation disk images of games online so people can have access to them. And in some cases, those people may violate copyright, and a lot will do so for a variety of reasons. Not necessarily that they're trying to compete with commercial purchases of those games. They often will see the violation of copyright in some cases as being necessary in order to ensure that this game is still remained accessible. And so that's often why it's referred to as pirated archives, right? Okay, so there are some advantages to vernacular preservation. One's technical innovation, right? So most of the innovation that we've seen technically in the emulation space actually comes from vernacular preservation in pirated archives, right? So different fan-based emulation projects, right? Things like the MAME have had a huge influence, not just on the industry, but also on institutional preservation. And there's plenty of cases where emulators that were built, that might have been violating copyright by fans, then get packaged into commercial projects and then actually get used by actual institutional archives for various reasons. And there's people who've actually done legal work in this area in order to ensure some of that work could be used as well. And there's still people doing legal work in this area to try to ensure some of the emulators can be used in order to ensure accessibility for games going forward, right? So there's a lot of technical innovation, a lot of collaboration, right? A lot of fan-based emulation projects. People who are passionate about preserving game history, who are interested in things like emulation, will collaborate online and do some pretty amazing stuff. They can also be quite accessible. If anyone's familiar with the Internet Archive and any of their game preservation projects, pretty accessible. Some amazing work the Internet Archive has done with making classic games available for play in browser, stuff like Doom. So they can be quite accessible, provided that you have access to an internet connection and high bandwidth, right? This also kind of brings me to its disadvantage, right? Legality can be an issue. People can worry about whether or not they can use what they can use from private archives, if they're writing books, if they're looking to do public preservations, if they're looking to give credit, right, to people who did work. Well, I say they can be accessible. Well, they're accessible if you've got a high-speed bandwidth and access to a computer. Not every person has that. So if you don't have an internet connection, you know what I mean, you can't necessarily access them. Also size and scope, that's also definitely an issue. That's more so for like private collectors. People have their own private collections. If anyone here has a private collection of stuff that they're keeping, you realize that you can run out of space very, very quickly. I would love to have a pinball machine collection. I would love to have an arcade machine collection. I do not have the space in order to keep arcade games and pinball games in my home. So size and scope also is an issue with vernacular preservation. So this leads me to gaps, right? So we've got basically a lot of cool work that people are doing, but there are various gaps, right? So what are our gaps in our current approaches to preservation? Number one's legal, right? Um, it's not, people aren't always sure what they can and can't use from different archival projects, particularly fan-based archival projects. The other are material technical, right? Like I said before, recreating old hardware, preserving old hardware is difficult. There's a lot of been writing on emulation, how playing any game through an emulator does change the experience. That could be differences that come down to things like frame rate, speed and feel of the game, sound, right, can be very, very difficult to replicate, things of that nature. And then also a lot of gaps are also regional and cultural, right? If you're actually looking at fan-based projects, they tend to focus on very popular platforms, right, like NES. But when you start finding platforms that aren't necessarily as popular, may not have been released in certain regions, right, you get a lot of regional kind of cultural gaps as well. So I'll start with legal. So as I said before, the expansion of IP in general and digital rights management techniques in particular kind of makes it difficult for a lot of archivists to do their jobs. So there's librarians who actually want to preserve games and want to make video games more accessible, but they can get cold feet because they're not entirely sure what the legalities involved, and they don't want to have to consult lawyers in order to ensure that they can allow, you know, someone to come into their library and play something like Doom on one of their computers without paying for a new copy, things of that nature, right? So there's a lot of archivists and traditional heritage folk who they're just scared about the legalities and they don't want to risk getting sued or getting someone mad at them. So they choose just not to preserve games, right? The second is material technical, right? So this gets us into some major areas of gaps. Some games are actually impossible to preserve due to technical limitations. We cannot preserve everything, right? The classic case, and I was talking with a few of my colleagues about this before, are MMOs, right? Any kind of massive multiplayer online game. So in the case of MMOs, player communities that were key components of the gameplay experience cannot be replicated, for example, right? You can keep an old MMO server running, you can have the same space in which players played, but if certain player communities that used to be active on that MMO are no longer present, it's a different game. It's just not the same game. And a lot of people who've been playing MMOs for a long time would say that, right? So you can't replicate player communities that are key to the co-creative experience of like an online multiplayer game, right? So you can't replicate what it was like to play EverQuest in 2003, right? It's just not possible. So you can keep a server running and you can play it with friends today, right? But there'll be guilds, there'll be important player communities that were integral to those games' success at that different points in time that just will no longer be present, that can't be replicated. WoW Classic, yeah, you can still play WoW Classic for sure, right? Now that's an interesting one, right? Because it's trying to actually bring older player communities back, right? And to try to kind of restart the game in many cases. Though you'd have to ask a WoW historian and a WoW expert, and I'm sure they're out there, with respect to if any of the key guilds that were integral to WoW's kind of development in the early days, whether they're present. And I'm not too sure in terms of the history of research on the WoW game community, but I can actually point you to, like, there's plenty of examples of other kind of game communities, particularly if people are looking at, I'm forgetting Spaceships, the spaceship game. Which is kind of like one of our kind of classic. I'm just going to Google this really quick. There's a whole EVE Online. EVE Online would be your kind of classic example of there being integral players, integral player communities that are actually famous within the lore of the game that can't be replicated. In some cases, because some of those players have actually passed away. So yeah, WoW Classic is EVE is the classic one. And WoW Classic is the example, right? And there's an extensive literature actually on memorials for players who've passed away and the importance that they had to game communities within the literature on massive multiplayer games, right? So there's a certain kind of remembrance. It'd be interesting if people coming from WoW Classic are actually remembering, commemorating different game communities and players who are no longer with us, right? So like I said before, it's like the players are integral, right, to any kind of online multiplayer experience. They co-create that game experience, and you can't necessarily recreate them. Someone's mentioning Fallen Earth could theoretically have been repacked and re-released like Hellgate Global, but to my knowledge, it just died. Yeah, it happens, and MMOs die often for quite various reasons, and the reasons why they die is actually really fascinating, right? One of my favorite cases about an MMO being popular but then dying, if you want to look into the Star Wars MMO, it's a pretty notorious case of things that happened that caused the community to die and get shut down. And like I said, yeah, Star Wars Galaxy, fascinating case. Shout out to that. If anyone's, I used to do a lecture on why the history of that community and why it failed. Fascinating case study for community management, and a fascinating case study for why players may do surprising things within an online game that is necessarily thought of. Yeah, really cool. And I should also point out, since people know that it's impossible to preserve things like MMOs, a lot of community-based preservation efforts actually focus on metadata for this reason. So while you can never go back and preserve what it was like to play something like Star Wars Galaxy during the launch, right, which was pretty crazy, the idea is like, well, if we can try to get footage of what the gameplay looked like, or some logs of chats of what the gameplay looked like, that stuff that can be archived and be preserved, that maybe future game historians might be interested in going back and saying, hey, why did this game fail, right? Why did the community not take off? What did people start doing in it? So that's where having metadata, things like footage of games, can be very, very useful. If we know that we can't preserve the game itself and that gameplay experience, it doesn't mean that we can't preserve metadata, data about the game to learn what it was like to play it at that particular point in time. And people like, Henry Lowood have been a huge advocate for this, support James Newman as well. Finally, regional and cultural, right? So we often find that a lot of fan-based vernacular preservation projects, right, a lot of collections, a lot of fan-based emulation projects, they're often associated to games. They're often around games that have big fandoms that are associated with major publishers and consoles. Games that aren't associated with major publishers and platforms are probably at the greatest risk of being lost, which include, but are not limited to, as I said before, MUDs, moves, and MMOs, multi-user dungeon games, Moo, subset of multi-user dungeon games, massive multiplayer online games. As we said before, preservation is probably impossible due to the inability to replicate social interactions between players. Flash games, this is the big category, right? It's not like you can just rip Flash games, right, from discs that are out there or cartridges that are out there and upload them online, right? You have websites like Newsgrounds, which served as the major springboard for independent developers. These games are tremendously important historically. And while some preservation projects are underway, lots of games have been lost, often due to basically if the browser is no longer supported, right? Flash games are difficult in order to access. A lot of developers who hosted Flash games on servers have then taken them down and have no interest in putting them back up because they don't have the time and they don't have the resources, right? So Flash games is a big, huge gap. A lot of people would say Web 1.0 Flash or browser-based games, Flash games, is one of the major gaps in history. And sadly, we've probably already lost a lot of Flash games to history already that we might not be able to get back unless things change. Serious social impact edutainment games, right? There are some libraries and collections that focus on this, but industrial and vernacular preservation projects, they have a tendency to like games that fall into these categories for a variety of reasons, right? So we don't often, preserve educational games, serious games. If you're thinking about a VR raises this whole kind of other problems. We actually really need to think about preserving VR now and virtual reality, right? There aren't a lot of archives dedicated to providing access to VR experience, particularly educational ones. We actually have staff who work on building these things, and these are things that can fall through the gaps. So if you wanted to teach a course in the future on, serious games, educational based games, and you want to show best practices from history, these are games that can be difficult in order to get a hold of because they're not often serviced by fan preservation projects or industrial preservation products. There are some archives and libraries that are trying to do this work, but they're underfunded. So like I said, there's some cases where stuff's preserved. This is Lemonade Stand Apple. If you ever played a retail simulator, is this considered one of the famous ones? This one is preserved in certain archives, right? But there's plenty of other educational games that really fall through the gaps. Fans just don't care about them. People don't care about them. There's still so much that could be learned about them with respect to best practices towards design. What it was like to design an education game in 2004? What were some of the tropes? What worked? What didn't work, right? Lots of stuff that we can take going forward for those of us who are interested and passionate about game design that we lose if we don't have these games in order to reference, right? So this brings me to the final thing of my talk, right? What can you do to help? If you're passionate about games, if you think games need to be preserved, if you think game history is important, what can you do, right? The thing is, you can actually do quite a bit. This isn't, we're not helpless. We are not subjected to the cruel winds of history, right? We all have agency. Those of us who care about games are passionate about it. There's lots of things we can do to ensure that more games are accessible for future developers, future fans, future teachers going forward. If you teach game design, this is one thing that I talk about. Maybe avoid industrial narratives of technological progress when introducing your students to game history. Good design is good design, regardless of when a game was released. So don't make your students try to teach your students that, you know what I mean, just because a game's new doesn't mean it's better. There's a lot that they can learn from older games. We should get them into game history and thinking it's important. So when they go into an industry, they're on board with getting the industry to develop better preservation practices. You can also use production models that include servicing, updating, and archiving as part of the development process to promote better internal record keeping, which we know the industry doesn't necessarily do well. So there's things that we can do as educators when we teach game design. If you make games, right? Use a centralized long-term internal archiving practice that's kind of distinguished from any kind of individual project-to-project backup plans. So a lot of developers, they think about backups when they're making games. I need to back up my source code. I need to back up this. I need to back up that, right? But once the project is done, there's no kind of long-term archiving process that they're thinking about because they're like, "Ooh, I don't have to think about the backups anymore." And then backups get lost, and then source code gets lost, and these happen. So think about using a centralized long-term internal archiving practice at your studio, in the company that is distinguished from individual project-to-project backup plans. And if you're a fan, get involved in local, regional, international projects and organizations like the Software Preservation Network. That's below. There's plenty of different communities that are springing up in different regions who are passionate about game preservation, who are dedicated to it. So get involved, right, in local, regional, international projects and organizations. If there isn't a game history or game preservation group at your library or in your region, start one and get people on board, right? Share information with others through community archiving projects and online repositories like archive.org. Contribute to these things. If you come across a game, you know what I mean, that has some cool art that's rare, right, that's old, that no one knows anything about on Wikipedia or online, you know what I mean? Contribute to these online archiving databases and practices. Contribute to databases. Contribute metadata, right? If you played an MMO, right, in 2000. If you played Star Wars Galaxies and you somehow have documentation of it, put it up online. It can't be recreated, so people in the future can have an idea of what it might have been like to play that game during that period, right? There's all kinds of metadata that fans have lying around that will be of interest to future designers, future historians. Share it online. Don't keep it to yourself. And if you're a collector, consider donating hardware and software to libraries and special collections. If you have a big game collection, you know what I mean, and you're getting older, consider, having it perhaps donated when you pass away, like the wonderful Sid Bolton did and ensured that we have one of a full library collection in Canada. So if you collect games, think about what's going to happen to your collection when unfortunately it will no longer in your possession anymore, and think about donating it to a library so other people can access it. Okay. And that is it for my talk. Thank you for joining me. If anyone's interested in additional information about game preservation, here are some of my favorite writing on it. And these are some books. They're very academic, but I'm an academic and they're cool. So there's Game After, a cultural study of the video game afterlife. That's by Rayford Gines. He talks about different institutional and museum approaches to preserving games. So if you're a nerd for museums, you want to know, hey, what do museums do to preserve games? That book's on it. As I mentioned before, Henry Lowood replayed essential writings on software preservation and game histories. Henry Lowood's probably been doing this for a very, very, very long time. Probably one of the leading experts in the field. Just released a brand new book about his collected writings. Feel free to read some of his stuff. Obviously, James Newman, Best Before Video Game Suppressions and Obsolescence, still a great book, released by Routledge in 2012. Phil Salvador's new survey of the video game reissue market in the United States. You can get that through the Video Game History Foundation and Software Preservation Network, 2023. And then also, I mean, there's plenty of articles. A shout out to Melanie Swalwell, who does some of this work in Australia, who I've been privileged to work with, has a great article, Towards the Preservation of Local Computer Game Software, Challenges, Strategies, and Reflections. A great article that you can read if you're interested in regional game histories and trying to preserve regional game cultures. Okay, so thank you. Any questions?
That was awesome, David. You have such a drive and passion for that. I really felt that come through in the
Thanks.
talk.
I've only been doing it for a big portion of my life.
Nearly my entire lifetime. So it's really cool. It's really interesting to just to know how there are loads of ways that we can help, and I think if we start to consider archiving stuff now, that it's going to be in the future when we're much older and the Xbox 17S or something is out, all of these games will play. Well, I've often found that as I've gone through like I converted to being a PC gamer, and I started getting to experience all of these games that I just missed out on as a console gamer growing up. And some of them, like I bought Fallout Tactics, can't even play it. It's on Steam, and it just doesn't boot on Windows 10. And it's a bit, it's frustrating because I'm going back to all of these cool games that my tabletop role playing group, they kind of like they exposed me to all of these cool games that I could have played, and like we play them together, and it's sometimes you find that one you just can't play, so it's sad, and especially with Flash games as well. I grew up playing Flash games, so
Flash games is the big one, right? Because a lot of them are no longer being hosted on servers, and it's just whoever made them. You have to kind of rely on who made it, you know what I mean, in order to put it up, right? But sometimes we find in people who do this history, it's like someone who made a Flash game might be embarrassed about it, right? It might not be an example of their best design.
Best work, yeah.
Unfortunately, there's sometimes a tendency for developers, if they're not happy with a game that they had made and had available online at a point in time, they can kind of take it down. They'll be like, oh, don't look at that. You know what I mean? It's so bad. My new games are so much better. But it's like, but these games are historically important. This game means something to people, right? Like, and that's why, unfortunately, you can't always kind of rely on developers to keep access to stuff. That doesn't mean developers don't care about this and don't do a lot. It means that there's different approaches, there's different advantages and disadvantages. And there's places where libraries and archives can step in and need to step in. There's places where private collectors can step in, and there's stuff you can do. You know what I mean? Just as a person who cares about this, right, to help. I feel we're really lucky as educators that we can promote this stuff amongst our students, right? For example, like the idea of having, if you're starting a game studio, like have a centralized archiving process, right? Where you keep things like your source code, where you keep things like assets, where you keep things like character and concept art, right? Because guess what? People who love games are also interested in that stuff. It's not all just about games, right? They're interested in the documentation. They're interested in how the final design's different from what the development doc was. You know what I mean? They're interested in all of these things. So keeping them around and keeping them internally archived so people can access them in the future is something that you can kind of do, right? And it's also why I mentioned some of those cases, because there can be a tendency just to have backups, right? And maybe the backups on a company computer, but then once the project is done, people can have difficulty keeping track of where those backups are. And some of you may know this from your own design practices if you make games, right? Where are the backups from the last games that you made, right? Did you archive your game, right? Things like that.
We do have a question.
Oh yeah, a call for color scans of case inserts and manual. Oh, so if someone asks anything else, feel free to ask.
Yeah.
So that's fantastic that there's a call for color scans of case inserts and manuals for PS1. So that basically means that, and these are the community archiving projects that are really amazing, right? So if you've got PS1 games and you've got manuals, right? Like there's people who do these projects, yeah, where they'll come up with an archive of scan your manual, you know what I mean? Contribute to this archiving project so people can share them and know what this documentation was like, right? Because that's one issue, a classic issue with the emulation, right? Emulated games do not come with the box. They do not come with the artwork. They do not come with the manual. They don't come with the contextualization. So that type of metadata is extremely important, right? In order to have packaged with games that are still available digitally, because they provide context, important historic context, and just context for people who want to play them, right?
Yeah.
As well.
I
So that's
I
a
do
great
miss
one.
I do miss that. Like I remember buying Xbox games. Like I remember buying Mass Effect 3. My mom took me to the down to Asda, I think, to buy Mass Effect 3, and I read the manual on the way back in the car. And you just, I mean, everything's on Steam now. Like it kind of takes a
Yeah,
little bit of the magic away. Like and
yeah,
like I've still got all of my. I think I've got my Halo Combat Evolved manual somewhere. Um, sitting in a box in my cupboard. But I've still got that memory of that cool thing I used to read each
yeah.
night because I couldn't play the Xbox anymore.
And
Um,
this is right for what Snope's saying. Also, because Metal Gear
yeah,
Solid needed you to look at the case for the codec frequency, right? Yeah, of course. Like, there's plenty of games in which the metadata, or we sometimes refer to as the paratext or the paraludic element, is integral to the gameplay, right? And you need it. Um, there's a lot of games that would use things like, I don't know if everyone's played Carmen San Diego.
no, I
There's
haven't.
versions of Carmen San Diego. It was a popular like educational game
Yeah,
in North America. It would come with an almanac, right? So after you bet a level, it would ask you a question, and you're supposed to look it up in the almanac. If you don't have the
mm,
almanac, you can't answer the question or get past
mission,
the next
yeah,
level, right? So there's all kinds of those things. Another great example of that people also kind of talk about is, and this is me talking about arcade games and arcade cabinets. The artwork in an arcade or an arcade cabinet does a world build.
mm,
And when graphics were not as what we have today, that artwork was integral for having players imagine the kind of fictional or fantasy universe, right? So looking at the artwork or the attract mode of an arcade machine was part of that experience, and that's something that the MAME doesn't replicate, right? The MAME also emulation doesn't also recreate peripherals, right? So there's a really interesting peripheral that was built into an arcade game, an interesting gun system, an interesting controller system, right? That stuff can be hard to. That's something that emulation doesn't
okay,
recreate as
yeah,
well.
yeah,
It can be rebuilt and reverse engineered in some cases, and there's some pretty amazing projects where people actually do that kind of stuff. In some cases, even improved upon, right? There's actually, before, you couldn't run light guns, classic arcade machine light guns, on anything that wasn't a tube TV. And now, like, fans took it upon themselves in order to build like new light guns that'll work on LCDs. We actually purchased one last
yeah.
year.
That's how we have some.
Chris
Yeah,
bought one.
yeah.
Yeah. Those are another of fantastic examples of the kind of benefit in some cases of industrial preservation too, when developers do these things. And so it's not necessarily about nostalgia for me and going back to a time that we can no longer go back to. It's about ensuring that as many people can access these games going forward, because it promotes the art, the culture, the love of video games, which we need to share with generations and people around the world, right?
Because
Um,
it's becoming very commercialized, and
yeah.
you want to look back at when making, like, it was those three people in the basement making a game, or it's a group of people with a passion to make something. But now it's very successful to the point where they're just pumping out just whatever to make money. And
Reissue,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And it's also, there can be a tendency to think like, oh, these reissues are all coming out, right? You know what I mean? So what's
hmm,
the problem, right? The
right,
industry will just
yeah,
reissue anything.
yeah,
They reissue 12%,
yeah,
right? They don't, you know what I mean? Like, they reissued the hits
yeah,
over and over and
and
over
over again,
and
yeah,
over, right? And so there isn't an interest in making entire back catalogs, at least
hmm,
like pre 2010, available yet. And for me, the PS2 stuff's quite glaring, because I love the PS2. I think it's an extremely important historical console,
hmm.
and the fact that that stuff's still at danger.
Wasn't it it was the I'm gonna get my console facts correct here. Wasn't it the first backwards compatible console, the PS2?
Um,
You could play
could
PS1
have
games
been.
on it.
I believe so. But there, at least it was probably the first one, the first Western one that had a lot of widespread popularity.
Yeah.
There were some Atari consoles that were backwards compatible that weren't that popular that were released near the end of the Atari's
The Atari
life cycle.
26
There you go. Someone's
7800.
got it.
Thank you, D.
Yeah, I the 26 and the 7800, but neither was too popular because the initial popularized Atari console was the VCS. At least it was called the VCS in the US. But yeah, Atari history is actually really interesting because you didn't need a license to make a game for the Atari. So basically anyone can do it. So there's
Really?
games
That's
made by
cool.
like Zellers and various companies. And there's a degree of debate over what actually counts as an official Atari game and what does not, like to this day, because the catalog is so kind of wild.
Yeah. That's
Yeah,
really cool. If you do have any questions for David, please feel free to put them in. We also do have a feedback form, so if you want to offer us any feedback, you can feel free to do that here at the link. And I just want to say thank you, David, for coming and
thank you for having me. It was
bringing
fun.
your passion to the Christmas lectures, and thank you everyone for participating in questions and taking part.
Yeah, not to mention Nintendo got steamed about unlicensed product, and I think they're the first to include measures to counteract that. Yeah, they're known. Nintendo is particularly known for speaking out against emulation and trying to have certain control over their IP. So in some cases, Nintendo are looked upon negatively from a fan vernacular preservation perspective. But I'll give you a little game historian tidbit. It's believed that Nintendo has the most extensive, most meticulous internal archive of any of the major publishers. It's believed that they have everything, and no one's been allowed to get in yet, and everyone wants in. So, well, it's easy. I could sit here and go, Nintendo is not good with fan archive practices. People who know this it's believed that Nintendo, amongst all the publishers, all the classic consoles, it's believed they have everything. It's actually believed that they have the best internal archive. It's just no Western historians ever been allowed in. I think it's only internal employees who work at Nintendo who get allowed in.
Only time will tell.
But who knows what's going to happen? But there's who knows what treasures exist behind the magical Nintendo vault. But if there's anything for you game fans or people who are fans of games that you want to dream about, you know what I mean, over the Christmas holidays, or who are interested in this, who knows what we'll find if that archive ever gets cracked open. You know what I mean?
It's exciting to think
about. One of my dreams. I would love to go through their internal archives, original documents from Mario 3, oh my god, like apparently they have like all of it. Right. I'll also say this is also when you see private collectors like paying a bunch of money for like a first edition, like sticker sealed Mario Nintendo. I'm like, cool. I mean, whatever's in Nintendo's vault is the stuff, you know what I mean? I would argue is the really, really rare stuff that people are going to want. And we haven't seen it leak out, but it's believed to be there. So yeah.
That's really cool. Well, thank you, David. So tomorrow at 12, we kick off with Daryl Marples, and he has a wealth of experience, so just working in the creative industry, and he's going to be talking about how working in creative and having that wealth of experience can lead to experience in virtual worlds. So if you're interested in learning about working in the creative industry and how to become successful in doing so, this is a talk for you to tune into. So we'll see you tomorrow at 1 for the Christmas lectures. Thank you all again for coming.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.